Hello everyone, I'm Deb and this is DB Designs and Sewing Australia. Welcome to all my subscribers and welcome to anyone who is new. Recently I had some subscribers ask could I show them how I apply my bias binding to the hem of the All in Easy Fit shirt, which is a shirt pattern that I use quite a bit. Here's another one that I've recently made, and as yet it is unhemmed, so I'm going to show you how I put my bias binding on. So the first part of the process is to make sure your fronts are even. So this is actually really even, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it'll be like 1/2 centimetre, so 5 mil different, and I would trim it to match because what I absolutely have to have, and that's in everything I make that's button up, it has to be even where it joins on the center front. And I bought a pink jumper, so I wanted a pink shirt to wear underneath it. That's why I've made this color. But it's not about the shirt, it's about how to apply bias binding to the hem. Now we know this is the same length. The first thing we need to do is cut a strip of bias binding. And so I did have enough fabric left that I could cut the full width of the fabric but on the bias, and so this one strip is enough to do around the whole shirt. But if it wasn't, and many a times it's not because I'm only making the bias strips out of scrap, then I would join them all together before I started. So I do measure around the shirt and make sure I have got enough to go all the way around so that I don't have to stop and join anything when I come to sewing it on. So now we've got the bias binding piece, we're going to iron it in half. Now this is a method I used for shirts which are generally not really heavy fabric. So I'm just pressing this completely in half, wrong sides together. And this bias strip is 4 centimeters wide. So when I've folded it over, it's 2 centimeters. Now we've got our piece of bias binding. I'm going to find the center of it and mark it with a pin. And I'm going to find the center back of my shirt. In exactly the same way. Sometimes I've marked this already with a marking tool, but I think on this shirt I used iron off, so it wouldn't be on there any longer. So now I am going to pin right sides together all the way around the whole shirt. And I'm not pulling it tight, I'm just putting a tiny bit of tension on it. What we want to do is work out how we're going to be finishing off the fronts where it will meet the front placket, which is here. So when it comes to the front placket, because this isn't really heavy fabric, I am usually just folding it back on itself. So like that. And then just cutting that piece off. And now we'll take it to the machine and sew it. But what we want to be doing is, so this isn't going to be seen, this piece here, you need to make sure that is well and truly tucked over. So as you can see, I have offset that slightly so that when we turn this over and back up, we're not going to be able to see this edge here sticking out. So it's really important that that's tucked up. Otherwise, then you've got to try and manipulate it once it's already sewn. So it's easier to do it before it's sewn. So let's go to the sewing machine. So here we are sewn halfway along. My seam allowance is 1/2 centimetre. Now you can choose to pin this on or not. It's when you come up to the curve that you need to take most care. And so when I'm trying to manipulate it to follow the same curve as the hem, I will often use my tweezers. Now I'm just following the curve. So to get the bias binding and the fabric where I want them to be, I will often use my tweezers. So I just worked out 1/2 centimetre or 5 millimetres by changing where my needle is and using the side of my foot as the guide. I find that much easier to do. So I can see we're coming to the end and I need to work out how much I'm going to tuck. Well, it's sort of over rather than under. And remembering that we want to tuck this piece so that it's not going to be visible when we flip this around to the wrong side. Okay, so we can see when I flip that over that we're not going to be able to see this underneath part. So when it gets turned over, everything will be tucked in. And that means on this side, we're not going to be able to see this part here sticking out the top. Let's go to the ironing board. Okay, we're back at the ironing board. I need to trim off these threads. And as I said, this is not a method I would use to bias hem anything that was heavy. I do have the coloured bias binding guides, but the shirts I make are lightweight, and so I'm happy to do it with a full fold bias binding. So now we're just pressing this. You could understitch it if you wanted to. So you could stitch this here before you flip it over. I'm not going to do that in this case. But you certainly could understitch it. So what I'm trying to do is make sure this is pressed up nicely. And remember, pressing is everything. So we're pressing it as if we were going to understitch it. So I'm pressing it this up. So when I'm looking at the ham, I'm feeling and making sure that fabric is still in the downway position. And I am using a pressing ham. It's something I use for everything. If there's a tool that you need and you make things with darts in them, a pressing ham is a very valuable tool. You can get them that are all different prices. You can get them that are $35. You can get them that are $115. And they're very similar shapes. Probably got a different inside and a different quality. And if you've watched me before, you know I've got a ham rest or a ham stand, which you can lie this in here like this. So I have just snipped off the corner. That corner was raised and out. I have just snipped that off where I made it go down further, just so that it's neat when we go to stitch it back the other way. This is just so that none of the underneath is showing. And it's like everything, pressing is everything. So now when we're looking on the other side, everything is pressed up. And when you're happy with that, you can understitch it if you want to. If I had a fabric that was just say it was crepe or something that didn't press very well, then I might understitch it. But this is organic cotton, and so it actually presses really, really well. And if you're using shirting, it usually presses really well also. Just for your fabrics that don't press really well, understitching would be a good idea. So now that's all pressed like this. This is the raw edges together and they're pressed downwards. Now I have turned that up and pressed it. And I'm going to do that all the way along. And this is my magnetic pin dish that I have on the ironing board because it sticks to the ironing board. You don't knock it off. So I do have other magnetic pin dishes, but they're easily knocked off. So when it comes to This corner, it looks a bit weird when it's pressed down like that, but once we start to press it back up, that extra bit of fabric that we've got there allows us to follow the curve. So I'll just pin that in there, and then I'll finish this side off and show you. So as you can see, that fits around perfectly without pulling. So what you don't want is for this corner to pull, which is why. So on the pattern piece, it's got this little corner that sticks out. Don't mind this. This has got a whole lot of different other sorts of hem lengths attached to it that I fold up, cut off, re-tape back on. It's a very used pattern. But this little corner here, I actually have that tucked in because I know I'm going to do bias binding on it. Now, if I wasn't and I was just going to overlock it and turn it up, this corner is really important. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough to get the proper turn up here. So if you're wondering what that little corner is for, that's what it's for. That's in the All In Easy Fit shirt. Now, not every shirt, even if it has a curved hem, will have that on it. It's just those added little things that heighten the level of your garment. You want your things to look professional. Now this is where we're coming to a corner again. And so it looks fine on the straight, but it's got a curve. Maybe it was better down lower for the camera. So first of all, I'm just pressing where the side seam meets, which is where the real curve is, the maximum curve is. Then I'm working back from that section, pressing as I go. So if you want to do the hardest part first, you can do the two button placket sections, which is where it meets, and you can do your two side seams, and then you can work back from either of those to the easiest parts. Now I'm just snipping the corner off that so that it's just not too bulky, and I'm also snipping that little corner there. So let's see how this corner works out. It's all pressed down nicely. Trim those threads because I don't want them sticking out. I don't want to have to trim off things once it's done. So I have my iron set to the highest settings all of the time, and when I press something that it may stick to, I use pressing cloths. I have an organza cloth, and I also have two Raja's cloths. Now, one of my Raja cloths is the one that I use for interfacing. So, quite frankly, it looks revolting because it's got stuff stuck all over it. But it's what I use for interfacing so that I don't ruin my good Raja cloth, my good pressing cloth. Okay, so now we're going to look on the outside. We can see this is what it is going to look like. Now, sometimes I stitch it from the wrong side, sometimes I stitch it from the right side. I think I'll stitch it from the wrong side, but I'm going to increase my stitch length. Let's go and sew it. Okay, so now I'm back at my sewing machine, and this is what I always do. I put it back in the central position, and it's an automatic thread cutter, but I like to have long tails when I start off. So I've just pressed the up and down button and just grabbed it with my tweezers. I use the tweezers all of the time for so many things. Okay, so now I need to choose a stitch length, and it's usually set to 2.4. And so I'm going to set it to 2.8. So I want to stitch like here. It's really close to the edge, like where that pin is. So I'm just going to use my sewing machine. Now I'll show you the foot that I use. This is the foot that I use, and I'm not sure what they call it. And if you can see this foot, it's got a little tiny arrow in the center of the plastic part at the very front. That's what I use. That should be exactly where the stitch is, but I use that as my guide. And I am going to back stitch. And when I get up to the curved part, I'm not pulling it, I'm just putting a tiny bit of tension on it to make sure it's going to go around the curve perfectly. Leaving the pins in till the last minute, and when I leave the pins in till the last minute, you know that you really need to pin it, because I'm not a big pin user. I will sew a lot of things with no pins at all. Side seams of shirts, and I never use pins. I just meet it at the top, make sure it meets at the bottom, and just guide it with my hands and with my tweezers all of the time. And if you mess it up, just stop. Don't keep on going, just stop. And if you've got an automatic thread cutting machine, do not cut the threads. Use your flywheel or your up button and pull out long tails. Then undo it back to where it was. Tie a knot so it's tied off. Make sure you've got long tails again, and keep on going so that you're back on track. Now we're coming up to the curved edge again. So I'm just making sure it's in place, putting a little bit of tension on it. I still haven't taken the pins out, and I don't sew over pins, so it's a good way to ruin your sewing machine. So just going slowly around that curve, and if you need to lift up your foot and maneuver your fabric, you can do that. And so now I need to make sure this stays inside. So I can either use my tweezers or I can use my purple thing to make sure So I've just lifted the needle and my scissors are over there. And so when I back stitch, I could run back off the end, but I don't want to. I actually want to tie this off because it's a big stitch. I've got it set to 2.8. I want to tie it off. I don't want it to come undone. So as you can see, that looks really neat on the inside, and it's very, very close to the edge. All that stitching. Let's tie off the other end and then give it another press. So you can see how nice and neat that looks on both sides. Gives a really good finish to the shirt, and I find for a curved hem shirt, this is the best way of finishing the hem. Now that's just my way of using bias binding in that case. If I had a much thicker fabric, I would use bias tape makers. As they're covered in dust, you can see I don't use them all that often. I have got one different style one, and like the set of 4 that come from the smallest to the biggest, and I have used these a lot of times. Sometimes when I do quilted things, I will use these. It depends how thick what I'm binding is, but these are great tools. So as we can see, still meets in the front perfectly. So that's how I do the bias binding on a curved shirt. As I said, generally in a lighter weight fabric or a cotton or a shirting. I wouldn't necessarily use that cut a 4 centimeter bias binding strip method for a thicker fabric. I might use the bias binding tools and do the one with the 2 edges. I do both styles, but for a shirt, I found that this is my preferred way. And when one of my students, she bought a pattern off Etsy and she was making a baby's dress and it had bias binding. Well, the bias binding was really, really narrow and it was telling her to press in each side edge. She just could not get it to work. And then I showed her this method. We worked out how wide we'd have to have it and she had it on in no time. It's also a method I will use to bind necks of dresses if the fabric's not heavy. If it's in linen, maybe not. And sometimes I choose to hand stitch it down so that it's not so obvious, or sometimes you can do a fancy top stitching or double rows of stitching around it. It's really up to you, but a very easy way of creating a very neat hem for your shirts and your shirt tails. I much prefer this than overlocking it and turning it up and just sewing around once. That's really not that nice a finish. That's my preferred way. So those people who asked me if I could show them how to do a bias hem finish, that's how I do it. So it's 4 centimeters wide, fold in half, wrong sides together, 0.5 or half a centimetre seam allowance when you're stitching it onto the bottom of the shirt. Then you're pressing towards the bias binding and then you're folding it up. Once it's pressed towards the bias binding, you can do understitching if you want to. If it's a tricky fabric, really nice to do understitching. So things like crepe and things that are very slippy. I have got a few shirts to make out of silk, so whether or not I do understitching or whether or not I hand tack, where you would do understitching just to hold it while I hem it and then pull out that tacking at a later date, might be another way I do it. It depends. If I don't like the look of the understitching, I will just opt for hand stitching the understitch just by tacking, so just an in and out thread just to hold it in the right place while I do the actual hem. If it's a deep hem, that's a whole different thing. If it's a deep hem, I probably wouldn't have bias binding on it. I probably would have created a facing for it. So you can easily create a facing for it. You could create a facing for this shirt if you wanted to, just by in the lower parts of the shirts, and you say, I want a 5 centimetre facing. You can mark 5 centimetres, trace it off, do that. That would be both the fronts and also for the back on the fold. Join those together and you should have the mirror image to flip up onto the inside of here. That's also another way of finishing off the hem edge. You can do it on a shirt. It's curved, so it's going to work perfectly. So as long as you're creating your facing from your pattern, it's got to fit. It has to. It's the same pattern piece, just made in a much shorter version. So that gives you something else to think about, how you'd like to do that sort of thing. But very easy to do, 4 centimetres wide, fold it completely in half, wrong sides together, and half a centimetre or 0.5 of a centimetre seam allowance, stitch that on, press it towards the bias binding, then either understitch it or not and flip it up and press it so that it's in place properly. And the places you need to be careful are on the sides where it goes up a lot. I mean, there are some shirts that go up a lot more than this. If I was going to do a shirt that raised higher on the side than this all in easy fit shirt, I would probably cut my bias binding 3 centimetres, fold it in half a centimetre seam allowance, and then I've only got 1 centimetre that I'm dealing with. So the wider you make your bias binding to come up here, the less it's going to want to fit. If you've got a shirt that's got a very high shaping on the side, you might want to reduce the width of your bias binding and make the turn up narrower. It will be easier to get it to fit. I mean, I quite like the way it looks when you sew that bias binding on and you press it all down and it's got that little edge of bias binding sticking out. I think that looks lovely too. You could finish it off on the inside and do something like that. It's just whatever way you're going to apply the bias binding as to how it's going to look when you finish it. If you've got any questions or you need any further information, please let me know. What I did, which was 4 centimetres wide, fold in half, wrong sides together, 0.5 of a centimetre seam allowance, press down towards a bias binding, then fold up and press. Make sure you've got it in the right spot before you start to sew it on your sewing machine. And I always increase the stitch length than my normal sewing. because to me, that's just more aesthetically pleasing, but that's just my opinion. That's not anyone else's opinion. Whatever is more aesthetically pleasing to you, that's a stitch length to do. So that's all from me. Please like and subscribe and let me know if you need any further information. Everybody have a great sewing week. Bye.